So I do have a link to the game and a code at the end, so if folks have their laptops or whatnot and want to play it, you can play it here if you have some time. You can write down the info and whatnot and play through it. Um, I'll tell you as we get started, we actually have two versions of the game, because I'll explain it when we get through it. There's two versions depending on how you want to play it. So, all right, well, I'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Dan Burkey. I'm faculty member here in the School of Engineering at UConn. I'm also the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education and Diversity. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is a game that me and some of my collaborators developed called Concept Under Pressure. And it's, as you'll see, an 8-bit sort of retro-styled digital game to teach chemical engineering process safety. So I was actually, this game came into existence. There we go. This game came into existence at a conference in, I think, 2016. It was at the American Society of Engineering Education conference down in New Orleans. It was hot, it was crazy. It was like 100 degrees, 100% humidity. And I was at the division dinner for chemical engineering division, and there was like this terrible, terrible thunderstorm. And so we couldn't leave the restaurant, right? Because it was like, like you'd get electrocuted if you left the restaurant. So we ended up sitting around for a couple hours while I waited for the weather to dissipate. I was at a table with several colleagues, both of which actually ended up being collaborators in the grant that ended up funding this. And we were talking about, wouldn't it be fun, to develop a video game about chemical engineering, right? And what would that look like? What would we teach with that and whatnot? So we left that meeting and actually said, well, let's kick this around for a while. And we actually ended up writing a grant and getting it funded by NSF to actually do. So the game here that we developed with a games company called Filament Games based out of Madison, Wisconsin. And they did all of the programming for us, and then we did sort of all the story and whatnot. But process safety in chemical engineering is a big deal. So we have an accreditation board, and basically, whenever you see on the news, a gigantic refinery exploded, right? That's chemical engineering and that's process safety. That's where something went terribly wrong, right? And so, when oftentimes when people think about process safety, well, it's doing the right thing technically, right? People think that process safety is a technical thing, and it is. In a lot of ways, but I'm going to try and convince you through the brief talk today that process safety is really a subdivision of ethical reasoning, right? Of evaluating complex choices that have potentially complex outcomes and trying to make the correct choice. And what that really boils down to at the end of the day, in a lot of ways, is decision-making skills or behavioral skills. So it's technologically adjacent, right? So you have to have the correct scientific or engineering background in order to understand the decisions that you're going to make and understand what the consequences are. But in a lot of ways, it's not a technical decision. It's very much psychological and behavioral. And so teaching students that tends to be more complex than just, hey, here's an equation, right? In this situation, use this equation, you'll get the correct answer, right? That's much simpler to teach students. Complex decision-making in complex situations that are often changing quickly and dynamically is a lot more difficult to teach. And it's also difficult to do as sort of a case study. And I'll show you a little bit more about that when we talk about it. So we thought that a game-based environment or a game-based approach might be a really interesting way to try and teach students about process safety and process safety decision-making. So this really comes down to thinking about how people make decisions. And one of the ways that we think about this is, if you believe that process safety decision-making is adjacent to ethical decision-making, then you can think about ethics being different from behavioral ethics. And ethical interventions, people have looked at this for a long time in engineering situations. They try and train them. And what you see is these things continue to fail, right? You continue to have accidents, right? You continue to have people making poor decisions. And so it leads you to question, well, how effective are those trainings if they're not really accessing the correct things, right? So these interventions continue to fail due to lack of awareness of the differences between what we call ethics and what we sort of call behavioral ethics. And you can define it sort of simply, your ethics is what you should do or what you believe you should do, but behavioral ethics is actually what you actually do in the moment when confronted with the decision. And ethical testing and training often make it clear that there's an ethical dilemma. So if I give you a case study after the fact and say, hey, here's a case study, right? Read it. What would you do, right? You're sort of priming them to understand that this is an ethical test, right? And there's clearly a right answer. right? It's kind of like, it's kind of, the answer is never kick the puppy, right, or kill the hostage, right? It's like, it's very clear what the right answer is, and so students don't typically answer those things authentically, right? It becomes very clear that they're being ethically tested, and so they respond in kind, right? And that is never really necessarily so clear or true in real life. People often really fail to recognize there's an ethical or process safety decision in the moment when it's presented, right? So there's this difference between how people think they behave and how they'll actually behave. And we want to try and get them, we want to try to use a game-based environment to get them to behave in the way they would actually behave in the moment rather than in sort of a retrospective sense. And this is just a great example of these things continue to happen, right? So Titan missile accident, Challenger shuttle accident. This is a big gasoline refinery explosion. This sort of kicked off the big thing in chemical engineering process. This is the point where the accreditation board said, you have to do something about this in a curricular sense because these things are happening way too often, and then they can. So you can argue about how well we've done this, but at least now it is a required part of curriculum. But you can see that these process safety incidents or process safety disasters continue to happen, and so the question is why. And so we actually tied this. If you look at the ethical reasoning. A lot of the ethical reasoning in engineering is sort of tied to this idea of Kohlberg's moral development framework, right? So people behave in certain ways, and those things change over time as they become more experienced. It's somewhat contextual. You can argue whether it's linear or cyclical, or whether it's really transferable or highly situated, right? So if you're ethical in one situation, that doesn't necessarily mean you're ethical in all situations. But this is a framework that you can look at this. And moral development represents transformations that occur in a person's form or structure of thought. And so if you look at how people tend to approach these things, right, Kohlberg defines them sort of in three sort of outwardly expanding concentric rings. So the lowest level of reasoning is what they talk about being pre-conventional, right? This is largely concern for oneself or personal risk. Is this going to get me in trouble? What is the consequence to me as an individual, right? The next sort of circle out is what we call conventional, right? And this is really where you think about, all right, you're not necessarily just focused on yourself, but sort of like your next nearest neighbors, right? This small group of people around, people you know personally, friends, family, time, money, things that affect you personally. How will this affect my family? If I die making this decision, what's going to happen to my family? And then sort of lastly, in Kohlberg's schema is this idea of post-conventional. And this is where you're able to really think beyond yourself, beyond people or things that you know directly, right? So concern for things like more abstract ideas, society, right? Justice, the environment, things that are more abstracted, right? And people will go through different stages, right? Children are often right here, right? I'm not going to steal that candy bar because I'll get in trouble, right? And here it's sort of like, okay, I'm not going to dump toxic waste in the river because that's bad for the environment, right? So there's different scales, and typically it tracks with education, right? The more educated you are, right, you typically go up in that. It regresses sometimes. Like I said, it's not perfect, but this is how Kohlberg framed this. And there's actually 6 different levels of this. There's 2 levels per rank. So you get 6 different levels, and one is sort of called consolidated, right, where you're really embedded in that mode or that schema, and the other one's transitioning, where you're at the border between 2 of them. All right, so this is how we've structured this or thought about this. And so how do you measure this? Right, as engineers, we're really interested in measuring things and how, if we're going to do something, right, how can I quantitate? Engineers, I want to quantitate stuff. I want to put. And so historically, right, moral development has been measured. One of the primary ways it's been measured is this thing called the DIT2, or the Defining Issues Test. It's been around for quite a while. It's a survey, right? It's got 5 or 6 different moral dilemmas. You give it to people, they have to make a choice, and then they sort of rationalize that choice descriptively by by answering the survey questions. And it spits out a number that sort of quantitates what the sophistication level on the spectrum is of moral reasoning. And it's been used for a long time. It's been validated. It's actually a pretty stable construct. People have used it for quite a while. What we found was that's not a terrible, it's a pretty good measure of general moral or ethical reasoning, but in an engineering specific context or a professional context, it's not as maybe good. And so about a decade ago, 6, 7 years ago, team of engineering faculty at Purdue largely developed a very similar instrument called the Engineering Ethics Reasoning Instrument, or EERI. Same kind of idea. It's based on the DIT, but it's highly contextualized in an engineering context. Right, so engineering ethical dilemmas. And so the interesting thing was, how we built on that. So we wanted to do something similar. So we actually went and developed, based on both of these, the engineering process safety reasoning instrument, or the EPSR. Same idea, right? 6, again, really highly contextualized, now not just ethics, but actually process safety, right? Process safety, engineering dilemmas. So even more further contextualized. And again, based on how sophisticated students think about process safety reasoning. And so we developed that and have been working for the last couple of years to, to validate it and use it in the field with students. So the way we developed it is we did this instrumentation node, we developed these prompts, we did content validity, response process validity, internal structure, and construct validity, so exploratory factor analysis. I have some friends that are much better at educational research methods than I am, did a lot of this early on, but this has gone through that whole round of development that you would do for developing a new educational instrument. All right. And so the interesting thing is we wanted to see how students were responding to this. So we did a think aloud about process safety. We had small groups of students. This was done at Rowan, where my colleagues are, narrated the decisions in the process. There was 5 chemical engineering students, seniors, who did this in the spring of 2018. And we did this quantitative analysis, right? So this is what I talked about, sort of those 6 different types, right? So you have pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional, and you have sort of the consolidated and the transitional. And so we did this with these students, and when you score them, what you find is that these seniors, right, almost all of them end up type 6, consolidated, post-conventional, right? And if you think about that, right, for a minute, that didn't make a lot of sense to us. So these students are college seniors. They had no actual, most of them, practical real-world experience in a chemical engineering job or real significant process safety environment. So the fact that they are as high as you could get in terms of sophistication about process safety reasoning didn't seem quite right to us. And so this goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning, which is, well, how do I think about this, right? And this goes to this idea of, well, how am I asking students about this? And so you can go to the literature and look. This is a great book by Bateman and Ten called Blind Spots, about how people make these types of decisions, make decisions. And so there's this differentiation between what they call system 2 and system 1 thinking. In system 2 thinking, right, system 2 thinking is, I gotta look at this couple of my notes because I have this. I always get them backwards, right? Right. Right. Okay. System 1 is intuitive. That's what I thought. Right. So the system 2 thinking is sort of the logical long-term thinking, whereas system 1 thinking is essentially if you read Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, right, sort of the snap decision, the gut decision, that's system 1 thinking, right? When you're presented with something that's immediately dangerous, right, your body, you make a decision and something happens, right? That is a lot of what might be happening in a process safety situation, right? Something goes wrong at a plant, you don't have a whole lot of time to think about it. You need to act and make a decision, right? So you kind of want, when we're teaching process safety, and you kind of want to force students into system 1 thinking because it's a lot more realistic as to how they might actually respond in the moment. Whereas a case study is going to get them into this sort of what is system 2 thinking, which is basically they have time to sit, they have time to ponder, they have time to reflect, and to make a carefully based decision based on interpreting and pulling a lot of their experience and different things. So there are 2 very different ways of making decisions. And if I give students a case study and ask them to read it and reflect on it and think about it, you really sort of force them into this, right? Which is not necessarily the way they would like to behave in an authentic process safety scenario. So how do you do this, right? How do you actually get students to behave in an authentic way in a process safety situation, right? So the decision-making process, right? Ethics research, when you look at this, says, okay, well, if you want people to respond, in realistic ways, you need to have them practice in authentic environments, right? This idea of pre-authentication. But as you might imagine, I can't take a bunch of novice students and put them in a chemical plant and say, hey, go around and screw around, right? And we're going to throw random things at you, and you're gonna make decisions, and hopefully that will all work out. Right? That is highly unethical. Right? It's unreasonable. People would get hurt, but they still need to practice making those decisions, right? So the practice field must present an authentic dilemma, and there have to be incentives and disincentives for different actions. And we have to think about, well, what what kind of things prevent people from doing the right thing in real life. And one of the things that we thought about then is that when you're making these complex decisions, right, there's always constraints, right? There's always multiple things that are happening, right? You're never just making a process safety or ethical decision is rarely ever just about the one thing, right? It's one thing in the context of all these other things. It's highly situated, right? It changes depending upon what the situation is, and that's hard to do or hard to convey in a sort of a written case study, which is what the EPSRI was, right? It's a case study they read and they make decisions about, right? They lack a lot of the context and a lot of these other things that impact how they might be thinking or how they might be doing things. So how did we decide to get around this, right? Well, if your answer was a game, right, then you came to the right session, right? So we said, okay, we want to try and access that same idea, right? That same idea of getting them into system one type thinking, not giving them the ability, forcing them to sort of make decisions in real time, impacted by a lot of other things that are happening at the same time. And so we developed this game with Filament called Contents Under Pressure. And so Contents Under Pressure, we like to call it, how we got it funded is we didn't call it a game, right? We called it a digital immersive environment, right? Because, we could probably call it a game now because NSF has changed a lot, but at the time we didn't call it a game, we called it a digital immersive environment, right? Developed to simulate industry decisions, right? And it puts the user or the player in the game as in the role of a senior plant engineer in a chemical process setting. And you in the game are sort of in the middle, right? You've got a supervisor that you have to report to, that's going to be sort of on your back about the decisions you're making, but you're also managing subordinates, right? People who report to you. And so you're in this position of tension between upper management and then the people that you supervise. And the story unfolds over a 15-day period, right? And the objective is to maintain production and safety in the face of an impending hurricane. You don't necessarily know that at the beginning. But this is based on a real scenario that actually happened. A couple of years ago, there was a major hurricane that the Gulf Coast. There was a chemical process facility on the Gulf Coast that basically got slammed by this hurricane. And they were asking people to stay to basically try and mitigate the impacts of this environmental disaster. And so it was this real process safety thing. And the neat thing about it is it's actually also one of the stories in the EPSRI instrument that we developed. So we have this really nice ability to compare how students respond to this scenario in a case study based in the EPSRI versus how they respond to it in a more authentic way in the game. The same scenario is presented in two different ways, right? And so the 15-day piece is because we wanted students to have some time to reflect, right? So it sort of builds. It's like a story that builds over time. So the original way we have the game set up is that you would go through the day's worth of decision, which might take 5, 8, 10 minutes of play time. And then it would basically lock you out and say, okay, come back tomorrow. And you come back tomorrow, they log in, the new day would start, and they do the same thing. And it basically forced them to think about it in a little bit more realistic time stretch. We actually developed a second version of the game that basically lets you do a single day playthrough. So at the end of the day, basically it gets dark in the office, right? And then the sun comes back up and you report to work the next day. So you can play it in a one-day sit-through now, because we had some, we wanted to use it in an industrial setting with actual practitioners. So it wasn't necessarily practical to have a 2-week experience for them. We wanted to do it in a training session. So we had that version now. I use the 15-day version with my students as part of a sort of month-long assignment. I give it to them at the beginning of the month, let them play it for the month, and at the end of the month, we do a debrief. And I say, it also is not real time. So if they skip a day or something, they just pick up where they left off. So it's not punitive in that way. But so if you give them 2 or 3 weeks, they can usually get through the whole thing. And so that's what we've done. And so this is what the game looks like. So you see it's very sort of 8-bit, retro looking. It was actually, anyone ever played the game Reigns on mobile? So it was this kind of idea where you're the king, and basically you were presented with different choices on cards, and basically the choices that you made affected a couple of different metrics, right? Like whether the people liked you, whether your coffers were empty, whether the priests and the religious caste were going to come kill you, right? And so you could basically swipe between different cards, and those choices would determine how long you lasted as ruler before you were either deposed or killed or whatnot. It's a really interesting thing. So when we talked with Phil about it, we said, all right, we could base that kind of game or that kind of mechanic here. And so we have the same kind of thing. We have decision cards, right? They get presented to people, and then we've got a bunch of different metrics that you kind of have to keep your eye on. right? So the first one on the left is sort of time, right? So the different decisions that you make are going to take a different amount of time, right? So if you make decisions that take up a whole bunch more time, when you get to the end of the day, you might have run out of time, right? So then you're rushing around to finish stuff. You might not be as safe. You might have other things that are happening. So time, different decisions take different amounts of time. And these are the three other core metrics that we look at. So the hard hat is safety, right? So how do the decisions you make impact the process safety in the plan? Is it a decision that's going to improve safety? Is it a decision that's going to decrease safety? This one is interesting. This one is your reputation with other players, right? And so, or with other characters, right? So it's a single player game, but there's a bunch of different other characters in the game. And the decisions that you make can make the people that you work with like you or dislike you, right? And so if you get to the point where you piss enough people off, right, they stop responding to you in the same way that they do if you're making them happy. But if you make them too happy, right, then they might be taking advantage of you, right? And so there's some complexities in there. And it's really interesting because we did a survey at the beginning. Students very much underestimate the importance of personal relationships at the beginning. So you survey the students at the beginning. What do you think is going to be the most important? And all of them like safety. And then you told them at the end, they said, the most important thing was my relationship with other people, right? So that's that complexity that we get in. They don't think of it. They think it's a technical thing, right? It's like, oh, if I just make the right decision all the time, this will turn out well. And what they find is that no, you don't make decisions in a vacuum. You make decisions in a complex environment with other people and other people's responses to those things. And then the last one also here in a chemical plant is productivity, right? You make certain decisions that will either increase the productivity or decrease the productivity. And sometimes there are complex trade-offs, right? Increasing the safety might result in a decrease in production, right? So those two things are in tension. And as you go through this, right, and you highlight these different choices, it'll show you which ones will be impacted, but it doesn't tell you which way. Right? It says, okay, this decision is going to have an impact on safety, but it's not going to tell you whether the safety rating is going to go up or down. That sort of left an element of chance with the students, right? Or not chance, but they're not aware of that a priori. Right, so I just went through all those sort of time, safety, reputation, and output. And then they're given decision options. And so this is just a short video of what the gameplay actually looks like. You can see, you can hover over and the two choices become available. So we'll say we're glad to be here. This is your boss, Wanda. And this is like your first day. You're like, okay, we've had a bunch of safety problems. I need you to tighten up performance. And so you can see as you change between those two things, the different metrics highlight at the top. So we'll go ahead and I'll show you that again just so you can see how it works. Probably go cut to the middle there. Right. So you see up there at the top, that one's going to impact safety. That one's going to impact personality or relationships. And so that's sort of the feedback that students are getting in real time as they're going through it. They might have 15 or 20 of those decisions, and different people will come in and talk to you. And so that's really part of the game also is sort of figuring out all the different cast of characters. All right, and so here's some of the characters that you deal with. So this is also interesting from a DEI standpoint, right? Because we're actually able to manipulate, one of the things we want to do in the future is look at manipulating the identity of the characters, right? There's not necessarily a lot, engineering has a diversity problem in general, right? And so being able to cast different characters in different roles, either in a supervisory position or a subordinate position, allows us to look at how students respond to different people in those positions. So Wanda here is your boss, right? I will admit the first time I played this game, I got fired at the end. So that was sort of eye-opening. Darwin here is your safety supervisor. He's got a really bad sense of humor and cracks a lot of bad jokes. So Darwin is the safety supervisor. So these are sort of the people that you report to, sort of your superiors. And then you've got a team of folks that work under you, right? And so Charles here is sort of your veteran, right? So he's the person here who reports to you, but he's been at the plant for a long time, so he's got a lot of really good knowledge, a lot of experience. And so the question is, are you listening to him or not? And then Victor is sort of a younger guy who's a little bit insecure about his knowledge. And then Emily is the new person who you just hired and is starting. So she's got no experience, so he asks a lot of questions. So they each have their own personality and their own needs and how you deal with them, right? So Emily will say things, can you help me with my timesheet? I don't understand this, right? Victor's kind of like, I'd like to work on optimizing that new pipe network instead of working in my normal area. So that's like a much more experienced take. And then Victor's kind of like, hey, I'm not sure I completely understand this. Can you help me out? So they're all sorts of
different personalities, and they have conflicts with each other that you as their supervisor also then sort of need to manage. And so the interesting thing that students think about is like, when we debrief them after, they're kind of like, God, Victor was so annoying, right? Or Emily, God, like, why didn't she know what she was doing? So it's like these real frustrations and these real emotions that come out. Students have really, really strong visceral emotional responses to these characters after 15 days, which is really interesting, right? In a way that you totally wouldn't access reading about them in a case study. And then there's this other piece, right? So there's this Maria here is the newscaster who keeps briefing you on this. So it starts out real nice. Oh, the weather's beautiful today, blah, blah, blah. And then as you get about a week into it, it's kind of like, oh, there's a hurricane, there's a storm in the Gulf that might be brewing. So as the week progresses, Maria's on the news updating you about, hey, there's a problem. There's a big weather system heading towards you. What are you going to do about that? Or how does that inform your decision making? And then here you also have your adopted daughter, Belle, right? So there's a personal thing here, right? So like you're spending a lot of time at the office. As this is this other piece of the constraint that students don't necessarily get. They're like, hey, the decisions that I make at the office or my decisions to work late or stay during this are going to have impacts on my family. So I'm talking about, I talk about these multiple constraints that impact people, how they make decisions that you don't necessarily get if you're looking at a static case study. We're able to sort of access all these different things and throw all these different constraints or situations at a student in real time, right? So we actually did some, we've done a lot of different analysis on sort of how students perceive using this. And so one of them that we used is Brett Jones. It's the music model. It's measuring academic motivation. So it's looking at how students respond to this. So it's basically a nice survey that looks at these different types of criteria of how students perceive playing the game. And so it looks at things like empowerment, usefulness, success, interest, and caring. And if you look at the data for this, pre-post, what you see is that there, most of these things increase pretty significantly. Small effect sizes, but they feel like, as a measure of academic motivation, they respond positively to the game. The only thing they don't really see yet is the usefulness, right? Because a lot of them still perceive this as a game, right? It's a game. It's not teaching anything. It's fun, right? But they don't necessarily understand how it ties in or how it's useful to them in their learning, even though it really does. If you look at their pre-post responses from a qualitative sense, they really do deepen their understanding of the complexity of how these decisions get made. But I think the most interesting thing about this is a complicated graph. But this is measuring changes in process safety. Like I said, so we developed this instrument at the beginning, right, the EPSRI. So we gave this to two different sets of students. We gave it to students that only had sort of traditional instruction, and then we gave it to students that had gone through and played the game. And so these are those Colbertian levels: conventional, pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional, and sort of the consolidated transitioning, right? And so you see here, and we did pre-post. And so the one I'm going to focus on here is, right, we did this retrospectively. So the EPSRI group only, so this is the group that only had traditional instruction in process safety. You can see from pre to post, right? So pre is dark blue, post is light blue. You can see here, basically, this goes down and this goes up. So they further consolidate, right? So the transitioning, right, goes down and the consolidated goes up. So they get more what they want, right? They transition, they go from transitioning to consolidate. They harden their position here, right? In terms of how they think about stuff. If we look at, right, the folks that had that played the game, you see the opposite effect, right? So instead of consolidating, right, they actually moved from a very consolidated position to a more transitional position, even down to a more conventional level of thinking, right? And we think that really represents the fact that they're understanding the complexity of these types of decisions. And those are all statistically significant changes, right? So that's a small data set that we did 2 or 3 years ago now, but it was really interesting to us that said, okay, this there's something real here, right? There's a way of interacting with this game, with these decisions in a more authentic way that literally is different from how students approach it, but they just do it with a case study approach. So we thought that was really interesting, and that's been our sort of solid takeaway, that we've said, okay, we have something real here with teaching process safety with this. So our ongoing work with this is Additional games we're finding. We've been working with Filament to sort of refine and expand the feature set in the game mechanics. Now the Google login, so all of it's saved in the cloud, so it's really a lot easier to play and pick back up. Eventually, I'd love this to be a mobile game. The mobile development costs at the time we started were astronomical, so that's why it's a web-based game right now. We are planning to submit, so the first tier of funding that we had was just ended. And so we're planning to submit a larger tier 2 improving undergraduate STEM education grant to NSF to continue developing it and doing more with it. We really are continuing to work with the EPSRI and work further towards implementation and validation, right? We haven't had a large enough sample set really need to expand it to a lot more students to get a big enough data set to actually do the full validation on the scale of the DIT2. And then again, I was actually just talking to Mike about this before in the last session, the data analysis. This game is tracked by Google Analytics, so it produces a tremendous amount of data about how students interact with it, the time they spend on tasks, what they're doing, how their mouse is moving, all these different things that you could mine for how they're thinking about things potentially. And so we're really just scratching the surface of the amount of data that we have. One of the graduate students that we worked with on this project actually did some of that data mining recently for a paper that I think he's presenting this June at ASEE. Basically looking at how students try and optimize those different metrics. So you can sort of examine over the course of the 15 days, what do they care about more? Do they care more about safety? Do they care more about reputation? Do they care more about profitability? You can see how those things change over the course of 15 days as they make decisions. Right? And so it's really interesting. You see a lot of people start prioritizing safety because they recognize it's the safety game. They recognize that if they keep making safety-based decisions, these other things are falling off. Their reputation takes a hit, their productivity takes a hit, so then they start to rebalance. They try and do it. So what's their optimization strategy in trying to do that? And that's much more realistic, right? It's not just, I'm going to make decisions, I'm going to make the best safety decision all the time. It's like, no, how do I make the safety decisions in this larger context of all these other things that are happening? My family, this weather system, my relationship with other people, the impact on productivity. So it's a lot more, we think, authentic way of getting them to engage with this. So the key takeaways, right? So games have really been used for centuries as teaching tools. I don't need to say that in this particular audience, but only recently, really, are you seeing them being adapted for use in engineering education, right? So engineering education, I have a graph in a different, so from 2000 on, right? So from 2000 on, you see every 5 years, right, the amount of papers and games in education is going up and up and up. So this is a really interesting area in engineering education right now. And we think it's really useful for the education for teaching, sort of, like I said, shades of gray type topics. Process safety, engineering ethics, things where there's not a clear answer, right? It allows students to engage with this material in a different way than traditional instruction. And we really do think it allows them to explore wrong, right? That's the one thing you'll find with engineering students that, a lot of students, but especially I think engineering students hate to be wrong, right? There's a fear of wrong, there's a fear of failure because they're typically high achieving academic students. And so allowing them to fail and learn from that in a safe way gets them thinking in some different ways. So this work, like I said, was funded by NSF by this IUSE grant. Landon, who is here today, was a graduate student who worked with us on this, and Brittany was another student who was at Rowan, and a lot of undergrads played this. And then these are my colleagues that I worked on this with. Dan is actually a graduate of our program. He got his PhD in engineering here in 2016. He's now a professor at Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology in Indiana. And then Dr. Cheryl Bodnar at Rowan, and Dr. Matt Cooper at NC State. Those were the folks that we had dinner with at that Playful conference in New Orleans and came up with this idea. And if folks want to try this, there's the two websites, right? So the day-by-day implementation is that website, epsrigame.uconn.edu. That will actually lock you out after each day's decision and then have you come back the next day. And then we have sort of the continuous version, which is you can play it through in one sitting, which is basically cupgame.engr.uconn.edu. You'll go in and it'll ask you some questions like, do you consent to using your data for research? Please say no, so it doesn't get in mixed with our data. You can use whatever you want for your login or player name. And then it'll ask you for a teacher code or an access code, and the one you can use is CCQQF, and that will give you access to the game. But with that, that took longer than I thought it would. Right? But we also started later, so I don't know exactly when the next sessions are starting. But I'm happy to answer any questions or chat at any point or lunch or anything about what we've done with this.
I have a question. It's specifically about the game mechanisms of the choices.
Yep.
So, in here, obviously, right, the choices all conflate, right, choosing between safety and choosing between these other things that will ultimately affect it, right? If you're workers on their own,
Right.
you really can't, you can't work in this environment. I'm so curious, like, how can you, I mean, I think part of it is you're not separating out those things, right?
And some of the things are not even, some of the things aren't even direct safety, right? Because, but they impact it, right? Because, like, for example, what you learn through the play out of the game is like Charles, you're one of the characters, I can't remember which, is diabetic, right? And he comes to you during the middle of this crisis, like, hey, I actually forgot my insulin at home, right? I got to go home to get it, right? And you have to decide, are you going to let him go, right? Or are you going to make him stay and work, because if he's off from Planet 4, the same, you might have an incident because he's not there monitoring what he needs to do, or he might be shorthanded, right? And that doesn't look like a safety. It looks like, okay, am I going to be a jerk or not in this situation? But what it does is it shows you that there's these layers to these decisions. And what you'll also find as you play the game is that the new girl, right, the new person, and some of the and the other people, they don't sort of get along, right? And so part of your job ends up being trying to manage the conflict between them, and how you respond to that impacts their performance, right? So if you demoralize them, right, they don't work as hard, right, which is an impact to the safety, right? Or they're distracted, things like that. So it really tries to show, and that's why I said at the beginning, right? So we surveyed them ahead of time. What you think the most important thing, or what are you going to focus on? They all say safety, right? Or what was the most important thing? What do you think the most important thing is going to be as you go through this? They all say safety, absolutely, 100% safety, right? Clearly safety is safety, right? And then we asked them at the end, right? And they all said, it went from like last to almost first in terms of personal relationships. Personal relationships are the most important thing that I need to manage as part of it. So, and then that may not necessarily be true, but it definitely is true, right? You're not making those decisions in a vacuum. So we really think that it gives them a much more realistic portrayal of how those decisions happen in real time. And they have to respond. I need, hey, the plant's flooding. What am I going to do, right? They don't necessarily know that's going to happen, but they have to render in the case studies. Like, okay, the plant's flooding. What am I going to do? Am I going to send these operators out to deal with that, or am I going to prioritize something else, right? It forces them to make those decisions quickly. And they can't go online. It's like they can't go online and be like, what do I do in this situation? It's like, no, you have to make the decision. So, it's interesting.
Well, that's interesting. Do you have like quick time events? Essentially, because that's what when you were describing they have to, because that's a way that you can make them do a quick time event, because as more people play the game,
Yeah.
some people might put guides up online.
Right. We haven't seen that level of sophistication. Right? The game is actually still fairly basic, right? It was like a $300,000 grant, right? So it was like a $200,000 grant after overhead and stuff like that. Still only got $100,000 to develop the game, right? And that was sort of like for the basic proof of concept. And so we're hoping with follow-on funding that we'd like to do more branching. We'd like to do different scenarios. We'd like to make it a more rich, more complex game over time.
I mean, I've played through the game once.
Yeah.
And what do you think the narrative is? I mean, I need to care about this new girl and her relationship with the older, a couple of the other guys, the jerk.
I think the narrative is actually one of the most important parts of the game.
Do I need to see and care about them? Do I need to see and care about her to know that, to really get deep into the decision making about process safety? Or can I just play this as a game and say, well, what I do to her is going to impact this?
We actually did some surveys of students, and there are definitely some students who basically are kind of like, I'm going to go in, and what they would do is they would reload the game. Right? They would make a decision, and they would see how it impacted it, and if it hurt them, they would basically go back, reload the game, and redo it. Right? So they were clearly min-maxing. They didn't care about the story. They didn't care about any of that. Yeah. And then there were students who stayed basically in character. And they would talk about these people like they were real people.
Exactly, which is what I did. I started to think.
Exactly.
I started to hate it when somebody did something that.
You get frustrated.
Yeah.
Like, God damn it, Victor.
Apart from the weather, right?
Right.
The guy.
Here's the guy.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we want to do in the next iteration of this is actually play with the identities of those people. Yeah. Right? To see if people are people harder? Do people dislike Emily more because she's a young woman? right? If we swapped her with the
She's
dude,
always right.
right? If we swapped her with the dude, right, and people respond to her differently, right? So there's a lot of interesting DEI questions that I think you can ask by manipulating the identities of some of these folks. But I think for a certain subset of people, it's kind of like click, 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 click.
The impactfulness of it.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting question about how the narrative, right? can
And I-
impact it.
And I think for most students, when we do the debrief, right, most of this, I mean, the students who are vocal about it are very vocal about the narrative.
But have we assessed that? And it's almost like asking people, how much of the narrative did you buy?
We've assessed that a little bit, probably not as much as we could.
Large, the adventure is
Right.
another one. It probably matters how much the class takes.
Right, and I think the students that are the most vocal about it, when I do sort of the debrief, because we come to class and say, okay, today was the last day, hey, everybody, let's share what you thought, right? And the folks were kind of like, I wanted to fire that guy. They get angry, right? They were emotionally invested in that they felt bad about skipping out on their daughter's stuff, right? They felt, they were embarrassed by, if they got chastised by their boss, right? So they had real emotional responses to the characters over the course of the game. So we think I really like using it to teach process safety because again, like I could do a case study in a class with a student, but this actually lets them do a slow burn.
I just think what those empirical issues, like, with what fidelity do you tell the story? Do you catch more people in engineering, 11, whatever it is?
Like, because this is, I mean, you could go a very different way. Like some of our previous work, like we've talked about, like, with VR, right? Like I could design a really, really high fidelity VR environment of a chemical process plant and have it be really authentic.
Right.
I don't know if it would be as fun, right? Because this is campy in a way, right? It's like Mario, it's 8-bit, it's got a funny soundtrack, right? It's got like,
Right.
it's retro in its style, and that was a design choice.
Right. You don't want to see chemicals
Right.
going through people's flesh
Right.
with high validity.
Right. So this was, it was a concession to both budget, but it was also a design choice. So, yeah.
You were both talking about two very valid and it seems built-in ways that players can approach it. Like you're talking about, can I play this game without any concern for the human aspect? And of course you can play it. Yes. People live their lives.
Yes, if you want to soul as human beings.
Yeah, the world is full of those, and if you want to be one in the game world, you're just as welcome to be one in the game as you are in real life. Plenty of people do it, and they lead very successful lives. But those are two